Welcome to the HFMA Colorado Chapter webinar series. We want to take a moment first to recognize our annual business sponsors who not only provide financial support for our chapter, but also share their knowledge and expertise through speakers and presentations just like these. Their support allows us to operate our chapter and bring our members quality education and resources. We hope that you will always take a look at them first when your organization is in need of any services or support. For today's webinar, we will be, I need to talk to you about certification. Reminder that certification is now included in your membership. It is at no additional cost to you for the training materials or the tests. Resources are available on our national website, hfma.org. There are also resources available on our Colorado chapter site. If you're interested in getting certified, please reach out, check out those things. We would love to have you certified through our chapter. For today's webinar, we're going to use the Q&A box located at the bottom right of your screen. And we will address all questions at the end of the presentation, but feel free to please pop them into that box anytime you have them. We will monitor that as we go as well. A link to download the presentation was sent out prior to the webinar today, and it will be sent out again at the conclusion of the webinar, as well as a link to the replay. So if you have questions or need to review any of the information, you will have that ability to do so. Today's webinar, Pricing Transparency, What's Your Strategy for 2021 and Beyond, is being provided by one of our gold sponsors, Guidehouse. Our speakers today, we will start out with Brian Chamberlain. Brian is a partner with Guidehouse, responsible for client project management and overall project delivery. He has extensive experience with next generation EHR platforms and implementing best practice revenue cycle methodologies, specializing in net revenue improvement and business process transformation across all areas of the revenue cycle. Mark Spihar, an associate director at Guidehouse, brings more than 20 years experience leading strategic pricing, CDM, financial feasibility studies, and revenue cycle assessments. Mark is active in the healthcare industry by speaking nationally on pricing transparency issues, and recently serving on the HFMA National Advisory Committee on Payment Models. Mark has also served as a past president and board member for the Western Pennsylvania chapter of HFMA and is active within the South Florida chapter. Drew Lineback, associate director at Guidehouse, brings more than 15 years of experience in consulting and advisory services to healthcare organizations. Drew's areas of focus include extensive business office experience, technology implementations, and revenue cycle transformations. He has extensive knowledge designing and executing solutions that address the critical business challenges for healthcare organizations, improving financial performance while improving employee and patient satisfaction. Please join me in welcoming Brian, Mark, and Drew.
All right, thanks, Jessica. So I'm going to go ahead while I share my screen here. I'll switch to presentation. Just a second. All right, so as Jessica mentioned, today's topic is around pricing transparency, and we want to give a little bit of insight on what we're seeing at Guidehouse from both of our clients as well as in the market, and what are our perspectives that providers need to be thinking about into this year. So there's a lot of discussion and activity related to this topic that I'll let Mark and Drew speak to a little bit more detail as we get into the content here, but we'd also be interested in, as we get into questions, if folks just have input on what you all are doing or some of your strategies that might be different than what we talked about today, we'd love to hear that as well. So a bit about Guidehouse for folks that don't know us. We're a combination of legacy Navigant and Guidehouse Public Services firm. About a year and a half ago or so, we officially came together and rebranded under Guidehouse. And I would say that the differentiation there is kind of our public services side that had been that more of the Guidehouse naming convention, and Navigant was more of our commercial services. And today we're all one firm. We really, from a commercial healthcare standpoint, we do end-to-end revenue cycle activities, and we also have a managed services division who does outsourcing work. So think of most of your business office activities within the rev cycle function, where we need additional support to be able to do that. And then the last thing I'll mention, just very proud of our class ratings and some of our Black Book ratings recently around the strength of our revenue cycle. So wanted to point that out, and we're happy to be here and kind of jump right into the content. So today's agenda, as I mentioned, is thinking really about what have we seen and where are providers on the continuum of price transparency, and how compliant are they? What does it mean for them, their markets? What are folks thinking about, and how are they reacting to the rules? And also, what are their interpretations of the rules? And what does that mean coming up in the next 1 to 2 years when there's some additional requirements coming down the pipeline? And then, of course, as I mentioned, our strategies and our recommendations that we are advising our client base on activities, and then also things to be thinking about that we may not all know the answers today, but we're having conversations collectively with our clients to just understand, based on the activities that are occurring and the momentum in their local markets, what do they need to be doing? And that might be different for providers of different sizes or different localities, for example. And then, of course, other revenue cycle considerations. So pricing transparency is really just one component of rev cycle, and why it's very timely and has a large impact to all of what we do within the revenue cycle space. Still only one consideration, and how does that bleed over to the rest of the requirements that we need to do to bill and be paid based on the services that our provider organizations are completing. So, for example, things that are really self-pay and consumerism driven, those are things that we'll also talk a little bit about today, and I'm interested in hearing some perspectives from you all as well. So with that, we'll jump right into it, and I'm going to hand it over to Mark to dig into a little bit of the fundamentals and what we're seeing. And again, I think give maybe a quick overview of what the pricing transparency rule and where it stands today. So Mark, I'll hand it over.
Great, thanks, Brian. And today, I think all of us are going to probably experience a bit of deja vu in the process, as many of us have sat through a webinar or two back in the fall on pricing transparency related to the requirements and the readiness strategies. However, fast forward today, we're almost 75 some odd days post implementation, give or take a couple, and many hospitals are still analyzing how or if they will comply, or even how they can use some of this publicly available information for everything that's available due to pricing transparency for their strategic purposes. As Brian alluded to, like today's session, we're first going to quickly level set on some of the fundamentals. Then we're going to chat about a little bit about the payer requirements that are going into effect 22, 23, 24. That we're not going to spend a heck of a lot of time. We probably could have a whole session on that in and of itself. We want to at least start to make you aware of that. And then we're going to discuss a study the Guidehouse conducted of about 1,300 some odd hospitals and their varying level of compliance. After that, we're going to quickly jump into some risks and opportunities that result from pricing transparency, as well as some opportunities that may exist on the revenue cycle side too, or consideration that leadership should take into account. So let's jump into some of the basics. Again, as many of us know, on January 1, 2021, hospitals were required to show their charges in two ways under the expanded pricing transparency rule. The first was machine readable file. And that was, the main part of that was the negotiated rates. That was really an ugly sticking point for a lot of the hospitals, and they were hoping to get things moved along. But let's walk through a couple here. The gross charge, that's your price in your CDM, absent any discounts. The discounted cash uninsured rate, pretty self-explanatory there. That's any individual who pays for cash for an item. This in many cases can be a policy disclosure because it's typically a certain percentage across the board. You don't necessarily have to align it in a column in the worksheet, although many providers did. This other one, the number 3 on this list, the payer-specific negotiated charges. That's the charge that the hospital has negotiated with any third-party payer for an item or service package. And that one, payers should have been specifically identified by name. And then obviously, as part of this too, you didn't have to disclose your governmentals where they weren't negotiated rates. Obviously, like I said before, this was really a sticking point for a lot of folks in the industry because it really pulls back the curtain on what's in your hospital contracts with the payers. Another item, the last item there is the de-identified min and max negotiated rates, and that's really kind of a subset of number 3. So again, that was something that we believe was really included in the initial regulation as a plan B by CMS in case they lost their court cases regarding the negotiated rate disclosure, which never happened. The second requirement there on the left-hand side is the consumer-friendly shoppable services file. And that was a listing of 70 CMS pre-identified shoppable services and another 230 that were provided by the hospital. In some cases, you had to kind of mix match some to make it to 300. Some small, more rural facilities couldn't even make it to 300. So we've seen a varied way of that presentation, which I'll get into shortly. Also, what we've noted too is a lot of folks tried to utilize their patient estimator tools to fulfill this requirement, which as long as there wasn't a barrier to access that information, it was allowable under the regulation. So now, another part on this slide that I want to take folks to take note on is the payer requirements that go into effect starting Jan 1, 2022. And I think most of us, probably would agree that it was a bit premature of CMS to begin the pricing endeavor, pricing transparency endeavor for providers prior to the payers. I know Joe Pfeiffer was really, the president and CEO of HFMA, was really on top of this kind of early on as an advocate for some change in the regulations as they stood. And he agreed, pricing transparency as a guiding principle is directionally correct. But hospitals disclosing payer-specific negotiated rates really won't help consumers understand their out-of-pocket costs, which is truly at the heart of why this was gaining so much push through legislation as well as the court cases, is the goal was for the consumers to have that information to make actionable judgment calls on how they would allocate their care based on cost. So it was really HFMA's contention for a long time that really the payers were a much better source of this information. And obviously the providers then could be on the hook for what was deemed kind of self-pay or uninsured discounts because the payers wouldn't have access to that information. Unfortunately, as we're 75 days post-implementation, we know where those arguments landed with HFMA and AHA's court kind of contention. So unfortunately, now it's kind of, we've got to move forward. Admittedly, a lot of providers had a bit of narrow focus, really, when it comes to complying with the provider requirements versus what's in the payer requirements. And therefore, we thought it'd be helpful to briefly cover this. Again, if we have anyone from the health plans on the call today or health systems that have a health plan, I think it is helpful to know, just to know what kind of that other side of the house is doing. So starting in 2022, payers are going to be required to issue 3 separate machine readable files. And a key here is that it has to be, and then we highlighted it, updated monthly. That's a bit different. The providers, the requirement for the providers was at least annually. Here it's monthly. So I thought that was something interesting to call out. So these 3 files, you have one, the negotiated rate for all covered items and services between the plan and in-network providers, historical payments to and billed charges from out-of-network providers, and then obviously in-network negotiated rates and historical net prices for all covered prescription costs. They wanted to kind of break that out into a separate file. Then, and probably more importantly for the patient, starting in 2023 are some real critical items. One, the personalized out-of-pocket cost information, where that's going to be the negotiated rates for all covered healthcare items and services, including the drugs, and then a shoppable services file, kind of a self-service tool that's going to be out there. And again, their requirement was only 500 shoppable services. Then starting out in the remainder of 2024, they're going to have to expand that to be everything. So again, I know it's a lot to digest, but we wanted to give that information out there as folks are becoming more and more familiarized with some of the pay requirements. We think it's pretty important. And again, we probably could spend an entire session on this, but today we're going to focus really on the provider side and some of those strategies. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this slide, but I really like this as kind of a nice takeaway because it shows how pricing transparency is actually one piece of the overall data transparency rules and regulations impacting our industry. So we just touched upon the provider and payer transparency initiatives, but we should also familiarize ourselves with some of the other initiatives and regulations out there, which if you haven't, take a look. The CMS data interoperability and the CAA, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and really figure out how they fit into the data transparency continuum that we have laid out here. I think that's really important. And one thing about this slide is kind of a takeaway. I hate to admit, I'm a bit colorblind, but we tried to color code kind of each of the dates as to what they correlate to, so you can kind of walk through that. I have a hard time discerning the different colors, so bear with me, but we wanted to show just how interrelated some of these data requirements really are and how they fall out on the timeline and just kind of things to be aware of coming forward. So again, we're not going to spend any more time on this. We thought it's a nice takeaway. Just be aware of some of these initiatives coming down the pike that could be impactful to others in the industry. Next slide, please, Brian. Okay. This slide, we start talking about the level of compliance. Guidehouse recently conducted a study of almost 1,300 hospitals across 27 states to measure compliance. Now, as we all know, if anyone looked at the data, compliance is a little bit interesting to decipher, and there's a little bit of grayness to it. So we tried to be kind of black and white, and we said that based on the publicly available data, Guidehouse really scanned for each of the 5 types of charges to be present on one of the files. If the file was present and the provider had some form of standard charges, they were deemed to be compliant. If no requirements were met, they were non-compliant. So overall, we saw that most providers were compliant at least with one of the file types, like for example, the gross charges, but some, about 30% were not compliant for either. So I think that's one thing the level of compliance was really all over the board, and some of it was very selective. Now, some of the rationale that was provided as to why they weren't complying, resource constraints was a big one. Some instances, lack of understanding. A main one that really we saw was really just kind of waiting to see what the competitors were going to do. If you're in a highly competitive market, I don't think anyone wanted to be the first provider to jump into that pool, not knowing what others did. So that was a big part of this as well. And another piece of this too is we found that some of the larger hospitals and health systems often were using some of the existing tools like MyChart or other kind of patient estimators to meet that consumer-friendly shoppable services file. And they were doing most of the compliance through that. When it came to the machine readable file, that was very interesting. It seemed to be very selective as to what was divulged. Like some, they would just provide ranges. Others, they would just pick certain payers, and other payers would be conspicuously left off. And so it was obvious there was some selectivity that was used to do that. And then a lot of us in the industry were very curious as to what folks were posting. And it was very interesting the disparate kind of ways they posted the information. So it was difficult for people to scan and consolidate and really derive insights on a particular market. And so to do this in the future, I think there's going to have to be some data transformation or enhancements made. Okay, slide 8. Let's get into some of the details. Okay, actually, next slide. And this is just a couple of examples as to screenshots on what was posted. A machine readable file on the right, and on the left, kind of an excerpt from a patient estimator. And really, some of these patient estimators were all over the board in terms of looks and feel. I think some of you have gone out and take a look at others. They're a little there's a little bit of a lack of consistency. Some are better than others, and some have been doing this a lot longer than others. I think that's part of the conundrum some of the smaller institutions that are resource strapped had faced. So let's go to the next slide. Let's show you some examples as to what we found. Okay, so here, and again, this hospital A was showing kind of some of their percent of charge and per unit rates, as you can see here for a couple of payers. Then you go down to hospital B, they're kind of displaying kind of more of the per diem and case rates. If we go to the next slide, we have a couple of other examples of other hospitals. And in this slide, we've got hospital C that's displaying some of the rates for their ER and MSDRG rate, while hospital D is displaying rates across all the payers, kind of very. And this is kind of what we thought we would see more of, which we did not. So again, like I said before, I think it was really dependent upon, the disclosure is really dependent upon the market that folks were in and the structure of the current contracts for those particular areas. Those with a larger or more material amount of percentage charge contracts still in play, which there's quite a few folks that still have that, we found them to be a little more apprehensive to disclose some of those rates, and I think rightfully so. So once we talked about the disclosures here, let's talk about some of the risks that many health systems and others in the industry are facing. If you could jump to that next slide, Brian, that'd be great. Okay, so based on the industry response, I think it's safe to say pricing transparency is going to continue to be a challenge. Brian, I think, can you go back up one more slide? There we go, perfect. And so we thought it'd be helpful to break some of these challenges out to 4 key stakeholder groups: providers, payers, governmental agencies, and finally consumers. And for providers, there's going to be improved compliance as resource constraints lessen. This will help with further clarity and standardization and really automation to become more compliant. So we think that's going to be something that's going to be really helpful in the future. Now, the key here is really having a strategic plan to mitigate the risks and capitalize on the benefits is really going to be key to determine that appropriate compliance or level of compliance that they're going to get to. Now, on the payer side, we know that the payers are already scanning the market information to add to their market intelligence of reimbursement relative to key competitors. Specifically, national payers like BUCAs are really interested in this data. This will likely be a continued focus of theirs for competitive intelligence and really an increased investment on their end in these AI-enabled tools and other resources really to mine this data. Unfortunately, they do a better job of that than many of the providers, and they've always been ahead of us a little bit. So that's going to be a challenge. As again, the payers are really trying to understand how to derive kind of actionable insights from all this newly available data. It is interesting on the governmental side, and I think there's still a lot to be determined with the Biden administration. They've been somewhat quiet. But CMS has a significant task ahead to audit all the providers for compliance and enforce those corrective actions when necessary. So, CMS is going to have to continue to monitor and enforce the ruling, listening to feedback, and obviously answering questions and really standardizing the mechanics of the files to drive consistency. So providers can actually use this information. So I think that's going to be really critical for the broad-based auditing that they're going to have to do. And then finally, the consumers. They're going to have to become more informed around the out-of-pocket costs over time. They're going to. But ultimately, they're going to prefer probably a patient estimator tool to get the clear picture as to what they can expect. But there's an interesting story or article I read back in the fall. The Pioneer Institute of Massachusetts conducted a survey related to pricing transparency and found cost estimator tools remain mostly unused by respondents at 78%, despite the fact that 7 out of 10 of the respondents said they want to know the prices beforehand. So there's definitely a disconnect there. I thought that was real interesting. Another interesting part of the survey was when they asked, who do you trust best for pricing information about your healthcare cost? Only 3% of the respondents said hospitals, behind the internet and friends. Health plans were number one at 22. So all very interesting. And again, it was a relatively small survey, but I think directionally it's probably accurate based on, kind of conversations we have with friends and family outside the industry. So there is definitely going to be opportunity related to consumers, not only about the disclosure of the information, but kind of change management, changing the behaviors on how to utilize it, which I think we all could admit is probably going to take some time. So I thought those were interesting kind of takeaways from that article. If we can go to the next slide. So let's dig into some of the risks that providers are facing with pricing transparency once what I call the veil has been lifted on these negotiated rates. Obviously, more challenging negotiations. Since hospitals have to disclose the min and max cash prices, including the lowest cash payment they're going to accept from consumers, this is going to provide payers, self-insured companies, and labor unions with really a low floor which to negotiate their rates from. And the timing of this risk could be taking place as we speak if you have any of your contracts currently under negotiation. So that's really critical. And from a timing perspective, might be happening right now. Another risk that potentially could involve both payers and employers is establishing that a narrow network that may steer volumes away from your facility to less or what appears to be less expensive competitors. Another risk, obviously near term, again, it's the $300 a day fine for non-compliance. Now, this is still a little bit up in the air because obviously with the Trump administration, the previous administration, they stated back in December they were going to aggressively pursue and enforce compliance. Although, some of the kind of the whispers out of the Biden administration is they fully support price transparency, they haven't really commented on kind of the way they're going to pursue this going forward. It's kind of taken a little bit of a back seat. So we expect more to follow, but again, I think that's something that we're going to learn more about as we go along here. Again, we have not heard of any providers receiving deficiency letters just yet based on what they posed, but it is interesting. I do know that some providers are getting inquiries on these rates from people. We don't know if they're actually legitimate inquiries sometimes. Sometimes they feel like they're people fishing. It's very interesting. So some providers on the phone might have some anecdotal stories for us, but again, we have heard that occurring where folks did not disclose and people saying their physicians want that information. Again, lastly, there's going to be that obvious, kind of public PR risk that media is going to compare your rates to others. And in some cases, it's not necessarily apples to apples, like some of your J codes with no NDC identifiers or certain supply codes. This is tricky. And so I think that's something that obviously can find its way into a board of directors meeting about a complaint when in fact that there's some inconsistency there. So I think that's just a little caution as to what you publish too. If it's kind of not comparable, it may be best not to disclose certain things. On the flip side, though, of pricing transparency, there is the positive press and the commitment to transparency that does increase visibility and your consumer or patient trust. Lastly, the risk is the consumer risk. That's the challenge on how that data is presented to ensure full understanding of the limitations of the estimates and how it really impacts their choices. One example is we know that a lot of these patient estimators were done, kind of for the sake of compliance, kind of put together quickly. And in some cases, maybe some of that information in these patient estimators that were just put in to be compliant may have information that's confusing to the public. For example, if you have different multiple prices for a same code, some of these estimators will take the highest price to be conservative. But what happens if that is only a small volume and most of the other prices are your higher volume for that same code, you potentially, if someone looked at this information, was making a decision based on that, would say, oh, well, hospital, XYZ down the street is maybe several, hundreds or $1,000 cheaper. I'm going to go there. When that's really, that information is not accurate, and it's the appearance of a less expensive competitor where your volume's going to go to. Again, so due diligence is always recommended for the information you're posting out there. So we think that's really important. So taking all these risks into account, the industry really should be prepared with a long-term strategy to manage this evolving requirement and its impact on the markets. So let's jump into some of this strategy. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, so as providers are building out or kind of refining these existing strategies for the folks that are really ahead of the game, so it's a good time to take stock on what progress you made, and since probably the latter part of 2020. So, how are your current negotiated rates versus those rates out in your respective markets look? Who posted? What did they post? We're having a lot of clients ask us to do that, and it's actually interesting. We're getting some requests not only from the CFO, but also CEOs that are very concerned about this. And then how are our institutions going to leverage this data to conduct a detailed pricing analysis as well as a risk assessment to the organization? Some other areas, your short and your long-term managed care strategies and compliance, as well as revenue rebalancing strategies to minimize the future risk. And I'm going to get into a little bit of that in a couple slides from now. And then lastly, some of the more tactical area of focus kind of in the revenue cycle space, such as the CDM. Obviously, that's the basis for a lot of this work, and that's really to ensure a proper foundation for your price development. And Drew's going to get into a little bit of that to wrap up the presentation. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that we've been advising our clients, particularly since COVID, is starting to think about how are your historical pricing strategies holding up, kind of the set it and inflate it way of the folks have done it in the past. For example, some of our clients are seeing their large tier one payers when thinking about renewals wanting to use the 2020 experience as a basis for this negotiation process. And hospitals are concerned about that because their claim utilization was really offset as a baseline year. So thinking about our historical pricing strategies, the way you traditionally dealt with a tier one or tier two payers, included is not just the unit price that you're going after in the market. Are you going to have a stronger push to site neutrality kinds of reimbursement? Those type of things are just a couple of considerations. And so thinking about that, does the set it and inflate it model really work, or is a more dynamic approach really needed? So even though this slide's a bit busy, I kind of view it as almost like a game board that highlights some of the variables that go into pricing and demonstrates the dynamics involved. So even more so in the past, the folks that are involved in contracting can really attest to this. They're a revenue source for the organization that's variable and subject to strategy and tactics and outcomes. So this is what we kind of think of as it's kind of your game board, across your services, timelines, payers, employers, a whole host of things. Then you start to determine, well, what's the right pricing strategy mix? Am I in a market that's going to be more actively going towards value-based care? What does that mean? Do you need a transitional payment model to kind of tide you over till you move there? One example would be we see like Anthem in some markets where they're pushing their outpatient APC model. That's interesting. How does that impact my pricing, revenues, margin, let alone my operational capacity? So this is dynamic, is constantly changing as the market changes. It's also good to start thinking when you're thinking about what's your go forward managed care strategy. Look at it by individual payer. What are my intentions? Am I looking for an alliance? Am I looking to realign my prices? Do I need to be more proactive in things? What's defensible in the market? So I know I'm throwing a lot of things out there, but up until pricing transparency, we used to have conversations with clients on if it's important to price your services in a defensible position relative to your market, relative to your peer group. Because larger hospitals and health systems typically had, a higher, broader range of services than standalones. So there was certain higher prices that they naturally had. But what we're finding is this dynamic's starting to change with CMS pricing transparency. You have to think about, in addition to what is in this game board, what price variation in the market, what does this really mean for your organization? What risks are associated with that, at what volume level, what margin level, at what revenue maintenance level? Like, how do we really think if we have two hospitals, one academic, like in nature, another rural facility, at two very different price points? Do I need to fundamentally think about restructuring that? And if I do, to what degree? We see that a lot in health systems where you probably don't. So how should I do this? Because if we're trying to make it consumer oriented and they have a choice where they want to go, they now see our allowed amounts. How's that going to impact their choices? And I think we all know that maybe consumers may not get, other informational aspects of like this. Like if they're going to a flagship hospital because of, you have higher acuity or a higher level of complexity or higher risk, there's just some dynamics that, that's going to drive that price up. So we're seeing a lot of this become evident in later 2020 as well as 2021 already. So again, we believe, one of our points of view is from a firm is we think that traditional fee for service model, maybe we're at the early stage of the beginning of a sunset process, which some markets are more, accelerated than others. So if we can go to the next slide here. Okay. So what should you be doing in the short term? And so again, a lot of these things I'm throwing at you are just questions you should, like, leadership should be thinking about. Like what are the risks of compliance versus non-compliance? What, are the best data sources out there for quantitatively driven decisions? So around future revenue risk, revenue opportunities, how is this going to frame your strategic pricing strategies for an enterprise? Due to COVID, what's your budget gap that you're trying to close, if you have one? Many do. And how is that going to impact your enterprise pricing strategy and payer contracting over the next 2 or 3 years? Another one's the competitive nature of your commercial payments and relative to the market. Now that this veil is lifted, and if you've posted or others have posted, it's all going to be out there. Also, another thing we talk about is service commodity versus proprietary versus mixed site of care. That proprietary versus commodity service is a real big one for hospitals. I had a client not too long ago mentioned that we want to be a low cost provider in our market. Well, why not be a high value provider in that market? And there's certain things you should feel very, very comfortable premium pricing if you have the docs to support that. So it's not a race to the bottom. I think sometimes that's some markets, folks are doing that, think that they're going to get market share, and that could be an error. So one thing just to kind of throw out there. And then obviously all these questions we're throwing, the impacts to them are obviously going to have a significant impact on your long-term financial and capital plans. Okay, last slide here. Okay. A common theme we're hearing about from our CFOs is we need to think about our enterprise revenue portfolio strategies. We need to think about what they are. And so how do they restructure this? It's typically heavily focused on commercial, how you're making up for that. Obviously, many organizations have a fair amount of Medicare Advantaged as well as managed Medicaid contracts. So they're really trying to think of their contracted portfolio holistically and how they may need to change things going forward. And then the next type of objective here is really think about is are my strategic reimbursement rate targets for fee for service? That's another item. You heard me mention earlier revenue rebalancing. So what is that? That's really a concept of looking, similar to an investment portfolio. It's taking your book of business with a particular service line, maybe a payer contract, and thinking about what my organization needs to do to position its services in the market to be more consumer facing, to improve access, to achieve the appropriate yield targets, as well as those margin targets for your organization. And then how you move prices around that book of business and what are the strategies to get you the next piece is really the crux. So we've done for many years, how do we optimize our unit price realization, our allowed versus our net paid yield? Part of that falls on the revenue cycle piece, which it starts where do we want our prices to be? Are we competitive in the market? Are we restructuring our price to think about what's truly proprietary or premium services? Are people going to come to our system because they prefer our cardiac or neuro services, or because of our quality of reputation or brand? What it might cost them out of pocket, really, in those instances, are really less of an issue. So that's when it starts to get into the commoditized aspect, something that's potentially shoppable and competitive in the market. There's also the facility versus the ambulatory-based alternatives. Things of that nature start to, we really want to start to think about. How do I categorize my services into these different buckets, or what ultimately boils down to, your risk, your severity, your complexity, your preference for a site of care kinds of consideration. Those are all going to be baked into your future state pricing and aligning with, I like this comment, it's aligning with what and how we get paid with the where and how we deliver patient care. And I'm stealing that from one of my leaders in our practice. I really like that because I think it's really important. And I'm going to say it again. It's baking that into your pricing, aligning that with the what and how we get paid with the where and how we deliver patient care. And there's a lot of other considerations. Throughout this whole process, when you think of your repricing and thinking about blending your wholesale retail pricing concepts, this dynamic pricing model that we're talking about, like how do I ensure that I'm not reducing my revenues? Ideally, the goal of a dynamic pricing model is you not only keep what you have and rebalance some of those rates across your enterprise, physician, rehab, post-acute, but you're also looking at how through this process I can pick up incremental volume, incremental net revenue opportunities. I think that is really, really critical here. Also consider, is your pricing strategy going to yield a higher net revenue per discharge? Because my pricing, my reimbursement rates, my managed care strategies are always so well aligned with my go-to-market strategy. I think that's really critical. And obviously, the last issue here is how do we think about mitigating future operating margin and revenue degradation risks? A good example of this we all experienced back in March and April of last year. During the initial COVID surge, where a lot of elective procedures were disrupted, and we saw significant revenue swings. That's just a window into what can happen if your elective services get disrupted. Anything elective is potentially consumer shoppable. So I think there's some lessons learned that we can take into this new world that we're dealing with. So now I probably spoke a little too long here. So now Drew's going to dig into some of the revenue cycle areas that have also been disrupted by pricing transparency and some of the potential considerations to keep in mind as your organization moves forward. So take it away, Drew.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. So we really wanted to talk about two main components that you really have control over with the revenue cycle. And these are real direct benefits, separate from the regulatory requirements that Mark talked about earlier, and some of the more philosophical pricing strategies that Mark talked about as well. And so that includes the charge master, as well as your price estimation and your digital health engagement with your patients. And so one of the main recommended steps that we're talking about right now is to maintain a clean and comprehensive charge description master. Because the integrity of your revenue and your associated charge capture are really going to be key benefits that allow you to maximize your reimbursement that Mark was talking about earlier. You can fix your and be as transparent as you want on your pricing, but when it comes down to it, if your charge master isn't accurately reflecting your charges that are being incurred, you're going to be at a disadvantage. So what you really want to do is use a thorough technical review of your EHR and your CDM to improve your net revenue by linking your clinical services to your billable events. And this really shouldn't be a one-time occurrence, but a recurring exercise that you're doing within your revenue integrity department. And if you have it, leveraging the built-in technology that you have in your EHR or in bolt-on tools to continuously monitor your revenue generation. we've got a couple, next slide you can go. We got a couple quick steps that we'll talk about that. And so the first step, the first step is going to make sure that your CDM follows all of the published guidelines from CMS and other authorities, and make sure you're identifying any sort of gaps in comparison among the codes that are within your CDM. So you really do need to do a deep dive in your charge description master to make sure that the data in there is correct and compliant with the guidelines from all of the regulatory agencies. Your next step is going to be more strategic and structural, and you want to apply some best practices for your CDM to make sure it's complete, and more importantly, that you've reconciled the charges to the services that your hospital and your health system provides. And so the areas of opportunities are really sourced from the CDM, but might lead to some more operational changes that can be implemented throughout the hospital departments, the services, as well as your revenue cycle to be able to maximize your revenue recognition and your charge capture. And then the final step is really just cleaning up, really focusing on any old or unused charges that are in your CDM, and making sure your current charges are accurate. And so it's a 1, 2, 3 process there to make sure that you're compliant, be a little strategic, and then clean up anything messy that's in there. And as I mentioned, you need to be doing this on a recurring basis, either using the tools that you have or engaging with someone that can analyze and do it for you. Next slide. The other consideration that we wanted to mention was, of course, kind of your digital patient engagement. And so as a principle, pricing transparency should empower your patients to make some sort of meaningful price comparisons prior to receiving care and define the value of the services for the patients. So as Mark talked about earlier, there's a subset out there that are distrustful or lack the savviness, sophistication to be able to go and use the tools that are out there. But we're also seeing that there are a lot of organizations that don't have pricing transparency that is digestible by the patient and as a consumer. And so after the quality of care, patients really care about their out-of-pocket costs the most. So they're really looking for a complete cost of the service, specific benefits under their plan, deductibles, copays, and coinsurance. That's probably the reason that study that Mark referenced earlier didn't have very much credibility with the respondents because they couldn't cohesively combine all of those important components for price estimation in advance of care. So to get those data points, patients really want some sort of easily accessible digital technology, some sort of transparent cost information, and most importantly, to avoid any sort of surprise billing after their delivery of care, their services. My counter comment to Mark's earlier study was that there's a Black Book market research study that happened within the last 6 to 9 months. And 9 out of 10 patients no longer feel obligated to stay with healthcare providers that don't deliver an overall satisfactory digital experience and patient financial experience. So there is a very compelling reason to bridge this gap between where it is currently and what the regulations are requiring in giving patients as consumers something that's digestible. And so forward-thinking providers will really be focused on some sort of disruptive technology or presentation to the patient to differentiate their hospitals and services. So taking out all of the competitive parts when it comes to the pricing and really looking at what is the disruptive technology or patient financial experience that's going to make patients choose to have their services at your provider locations. So it takes those pricing transparency regulations one step further to really provide an outstanding experience in addition to the quality of care that they're receiving. And as I mentioned, kind of the digital patient experience is critical to being disruptive with functions like online scheduling, text and email communications that combine all of the key components for them with their pricing. All right, next slide. So really, what's the takeaway here? So what you want to do is make sure that you're enabling your patients to shop for services at your facility and at competing facilities. And if you're transparent and upfront about the pricing, you'll really attract patients from those other facilities that don't offer your advanced self-service estimation capabilities. And if you're good at it, you'll protect your recurring revenue from your existing patients and potentially through word of mouth and some of the other things that Mark talked about earlier, be able to garner a portion of the market for your services. And really, cost estimation allows for an easier conversation about financial responsibility at the time of service, which makes it easier to collect, things like accelerating your cash and decreasing your cost to collect. Much more complicated and deep dive for your revenue cycle than some of the philosophical pricing things that Mark talked about earlier, but is going to be the end user facing component that's going to set you apart from your competitors and take out the disadvantage of some of the requirements from the regulatory agencies earlier about pricing transparency. And that, I think, is it. If we want to transition over maybe to the Q&A section. I know we've had a couple come in, at least through the Q&A, and at least maybe one through the chat box. Brian, are you going to take that?
Yeah, it looks like Eugene had asked a couple of questions. So one, around the negotiated rates, meaning that they're requiring the most effort. So what approaches have we seen for adherence to the payer-specific price estimates? And, I think my initial take on that, and I'll open up to Mark and Drew for commentary as well, is I look at that as two different answers. So when we think about the approach of the price estimate versus the approach of publicizing the reimbursement rate for that procedure. So the reimbursement rate for the procedure is kind of more of a black and white, here's what our contracted rates are for an MRI of the knee, for example. And so our managed care teams at our clients are typically handling that. And I think sometimes what we described today is in absence of a little bit of what revenue cycle perspective is, but they're viewing that as more of, let's cut out my managed care reimbursement rates for these procedures and just be very specific around what my reimbursement rate is for that respective CPT or procedure. The other piece of this question, I think, is around how do we adhere to the price estimates and the patient out-of-pocket responsibilities. And we've seen this largely, I think, Mark, you may have even mentioned this, around some of the either existing technologies or EHRs that have embedded price tools already in place. So we have not seen a lot of clients enacting new price estimate policies as of yet, specific to price transparency. They're largely taking their existing infrastructure, and if they need to mold it to maybe these 300 chappable services to make sure that those are incorporated, that's kind of the avenue that we've seen them take. So Mark or Drew, I don't know if I've missed the mark on any of that or if you have anything else to add.
No, I think it was well put. I think another variable here is the requirement for the payers. They're going to have to do this starting in 2023. So do you have some providers just hold on and publish kind of where they are right now and wait for that to come out to see where they need to fill in the gaps for their consumers? So we're seeing a lot of things across the board. There are some that do it better than others, some that have approached this kind of pricing transparency, years ago and have some really good estimators out there. I don't plug for many estimators, but I would say just go out if that's something you're in the market for. There's a lot of good vendors out there. I think we're going to see some new faces here as well. I think Drew touched upon the technology. I think there was an article now that Amazon's ramping up their telehealth capabilities. So I think we're going to probably see some other players, maybe somebody that does it even better. So I think there's more to follow, Eugene, on that. But I think the payer element to this intrigues me because they should be able to do it really well. And the fact that your consumers can go right there, and then you'll probably have to fill in the gaps for the self-pay. So what does that mean for the pricing transparency requirements for the providers after those dates? It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yep. Yeah, and I think Eugene kind of followed up with, how do the patients interpret some of that? So we know that the pricing is going to potentially vary, and at least the charge estimate are coming out of the provider. So what do the patients make out of that, right? So the example they provided, or Eugene, you provided, is, there's a $40,000 charge, that's gross charges. How does the patient interpret their responsibility of that? So I think, again, there's a lot of, you mentioned what's included and excluded. Is it preoperative care or postoperative care? I think our take on that is to make sure that the price estimates are all encompassing of what we would expect that episode of care being. And that can vary, right? For surgeries, I think it is a little bit more clear cut with maybe a post-operative visit. If it's a simple office visit, right, it's just that particular professional charge and maybe not any additional charges that are done in the office. So there's a lot of variability here that I think certainly complicates it. And what we're going to continue to see providers be challenged with accuracy going forward.
Yeah,
Well, and I think
okay, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think the kind of the elephant in the room that is here for us is the patient education piece. So the first component of all of this and the objective behind all of this was to have pricing available for patients to be able to see. And then the most immediate step after that is educating them on what that means, because prior they would call in or they go to the estimator and it'd say you owe $5,000 because your insurance says that's what the portion that you will owe. Now they're going to see multiple numbers there, right? Like Eugene's example, $40,000 in total charges, but that's not actually what's getting paid, and it's definitely not what you as an insured patient would be responsible for. And so this probably ties into things like your revenue cycle customer service or your pre-service scheduling and pre-registration folks that are now responsible for saying, okay, you can see on our website that there is, that it's going to be a $40,000 knee replacement. But once we take into account all of the other factors, this is really what you'll be. And that will take some time to get through to the majority of patients, and then it will become a little bit more common sense, I think, for everyone out there. I'm sorry I cut you off, Mark. Go ahead.
No, I think that's spot on. Absolutely. No, and I think that's a really critical aspect of all of this, and the connection between your patient access and the folks that derive the prices. There's sometimes that natural disconnect in an organization and how prices are derived or charges are derived. Some of that, kind of talking points don't make it down to the people that are kind of interfacing, with the public as they're coming in with these questions. I think that's absolutely. Another thing that's interesting too is this with this whole charge dynamic is sometimes it's not even the out of pocket, having this information out there. Like I'll give you guys a story. Recently, back in November, we traveled for Thanksgiving. We were kind of some of the people that probably shouldn't have been traveling, but we wanted to see my parents. And we had to get my 2 young children tested. But we didn't have, when I got my EOB, I went ballistic because the charges for each individual COVID test was $1,600 per child. Even though I didn't know a nickel on that, that was something that just kind of, raised the hair in the back of my neck. That's egregious. That's just not right. Because I think many of us on the phone here know that's, the COVID tests are much, less expensive than $1,600. And the funny thing was my payer, I'm not going to name names, actually paid $1,200 of it. So it was a little bit, those type of things out there, from pricing, the charges to reimbursement. I think there's going to be a lot of things going on. That one slide that we showed with all the pay requirements and the CAA, I think there's just a lot of regulations that the hospitals and the payers and really our industry as a whole are digesting. And it'll be very interesting to see the take of the Biden administration as to where they go with all this. Are they going to come down on the providers and really enforce a lot of this? Is there going to be more wiggle room? Those type of things. So I think that's it. Any other questions? I don't think we do, Brian.
No, I don't think so at this time.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, Brian, and Drew. We really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise with us.